Before we begin looking at Vagrant and Puppet, let's talk about what virtualization is and why you would want to use it as an individual developer. So we'll start with what exactly is virtualization. According to Wikipedia, virtualization refers to some method of creating a virtual version of something, rather than an actual version of something. And this could be a virtual hardware platform, a virtual operating system, storage device, network resource, anything like that. If you're running a Mac, there's a good chance that you've run a version of Windows inside of a tool such as Boot Camp or VirtualBox, Parallels, or VMware Fusion. In all of those cases, you're running a virtual machine. Windows thinks it's running on actual hardware, but instead, it's running inside another operating system. That Windows machine is a virtual machine. You may have also heard of virtualization if you've heard of VPS web hosting. That stands for having a virtual private server. When you're using VPS hosting, you may, for example, log into your server with SSH and actually perform commands on a command line, as if you were working on an actual hardware server. However, you aren't actually working with an actual hardware machine. Your virtual private server is one of many virtual machines running on a single piece of hardware. Running your web application on virtual servers instead of real servers will of course be much less expensive and can make it much simpler when necessary to have your one server web application, for example, spread to two servers to get a separate database server because they're all virtual and therefore very easy to build and start up with. But when we're talking about developing locally on your own computer, what are some of the benefits to virtualization? Well, the main benefit for you as a developer is that you can build your applications in a well-planned, customized environment. You don't need dedicated hardware for each project. You can have multiple, vastly different virtual machines all running on one computer. Virtual machines also make it very simple to run different versions of tools for different projects without having them conflict. For example, you may have one virtual machine that's running Rails 2 and another virtual machine that's running Rails 3 for two completely different projects. Building your project in a virtual machine can also make it really easy to reduce the number of differences between your development environment and your production environment. You may have run across a bug in the past where you have an application running locally, it works just fine, but then when you try to deploy it to your production server, there's something wrong, and you have to do a whole bunch of debugging on your production server. However, with a virtual machine, you can set up that machine so that it is identical to the production server. Maybe you even have an operating system image or a set of configuration files, the kind of thing we'll be looking at in this screencast course, so that you can configure a virtual machine and then use those same files to configure a production server. This way, your production environment and your development environment are pretty much identical. Now, there are a few downsides to virtualization. As you might imagine, running multiple computers inside another computer can be pretty resource intensive. You're going to want to be using a modern machine with a decent CPU and plenty of RAM, as well as a lot of disk space. However, as long as you're running something along those lines, you shouldn't worry too much about bogging down your computer. At the very least, you won't want to have too many virtual machines running at once. So I hope I've convinced you that virtualization is a good idea, even for an individual developer working locally. So now let's go ahead and get some of our virtualization tools installed.